About 500 years ago, Columbus set sail to the west in hopes of finding a route to India and a piece of the spice trade. In particular, he was after pepper. Now, when he arrived in the Americas, he didn't find pepper, but what he found was a treasure chest loaded with things that had never been seen in the old world before. There was tobacco, there was corn, there was beans, and there was chilies. Today we're going to focus on chilies, and we're going to do it from Mexico. Mexico is ground zero for chilies, and they do magical things with them. There's a lot of confusion surrounding chilies, and I'm going to try and clear up some of that right here and right now. The confusion comes from the fact that from one culture to another, they call the same chili something different. If the chili is ripe versus underripe, it may have a different name. Dry it, and the name changes again. So, as an example, here is a jalapeno. On a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of heat, it's right in the middle, 4 or 5. It has a green, grassy flavor, and when you bite into it, it eats like a green pepper. It's very juicy and crispy. If I take that chili and I dry it over a slow, smoky fire, that chili becomes a chipotle. This is a chipotle meco, or a tan chipotle. It's green and now smoky. When you smell it, it has the most amazing, smoky, delicious depth of aroma. If I were to take that chili and ripen it, it would also be a chipotle, but oftentimes the way we see it is canned. And so this is a ripe jalapeno that was smoked and dried, and then it's cooked in an adobo sauce. All right, so 3 different examples: chipotle colorado, chipotle meco, and a fresh jalapeno. Let me take these back, and I'll give you another example. Here are 2 chilies. One of them we're going to use in our dish today, a little bit later on. They look almost identical. Unless you're a chef, it's hard to tell them apart. This one is a little bit more wrinkled. And what that means to me is that when it was fresh, the flesh was thicker. This one is a little bit smoother, and when it was fresh, the flesh was very thin. This is a guajillo. This is a New Mexico. Now, the guajillo has a flavor that is almost citrusy and lean. It's very bright tasting. This is the New Mexico, and it has almost a sweet flavor. Most of the chili powder that you've ever consumed in the United States comes from this chili right here. It doesn't have any bitterness or awkward flavors. It's not harsh, it's not overly hot. This is kind of the white bread, I would say, of chilies. All right, so we'll put those away. Let me show you 2 others. Here is a chili ancho, and here is a chili mulatto. Those 2 chilies come from something that looks like that. That's a chili poblano. This is fresh. If you allow it to ripen, so you allow it to turn completely ripe, it will become an ancho. And now, this certainly isn't completely ripe yet, but you can see it's on its way. The mulatto is a chili that hasn't ripened all the way. This is probably fairly accurate right here, and it is dried before it's reached full ripeness. So anchos tend to have a flavor that is very deep and rich and fruity. It reminds me sometimes of sun-dried tomatoes, even of prunes. There's a sweetness to anchos that you will not see in a mulatto. A mulatto, because it's harvested green, will have a green vegetal flavor. And oftentimes they will use that chili right there to balance the richness and the sweetness of a ripe chili, which at the end of the day is nothing more than ripe fruit. Now, while we're here, let me just add this chili as well. This chili in the middle now is a chili negro or a pasilla negro. Pasilla, passageway, so long and thin. Negro, obviously black. So this should be a long, thin, black chili, and indeed it is. When it's fresh, it's a chalaca, and it grows almost in corkscrew fashion. This chili is also harvested and dried green. So the mulatto and the chile negro or pasilla negro are used to balance the sweetness of other ripe chilies. While I'm here, take a look. These two chilies are almost identical. They're really difficult to tell apart. And I would suggest to you that one of the only ways is to tear the chili open, get rid of the seeds, and then hold it up to a light. And when I do, what you'll notice is that one of them is a deep, deep red. That's the ancho. The other is a little bit lighter and more brown, and that is the mulatto. Sometimes the difference is subtle. Other times it's more pronounced. But safe for you is to go to the store and buy mulatto distinct from ancho. All right, again, let's set these back. If I were to take this ancho and toast it and grind it, I would end up with a varietal chili powder. And this is ancho chili powder. It has a much deeper flavor than the chili powder that you're familiar with in this country. And just by way of full disclosure, when you buy chili powder in the United States, typically it's mixed with cumin, it's mixed with oregano, it's mixed with garlic powder, and all kinds of other spices. What you see here is a true varietal chili powder with nothing else added. The last thing I want to show you is this. Those are chili arbol. And if you need a rule of thumb, the smaller a chili is and the redder a chili is, the hotter it's going to be. So if I were to add this to a dish, let's say I'm pickling some cucumbers and I want some heat, chili arbol would be the one that I would reach for. If I wanted chili flakes, I would grind this up. If I wanted something akin to cayenne powder, I would grind this up and you would have something really, really hot. All right. Now that you know a little bit about chilies, what I want to do is get on with making a dish called mole that will show you how to work with chilies, but also show you a lot of other techniques that are indicative of Mexican cuisine. So, one of the ingredients in mole, maybe the most important ingredient, is chilies. If you can believe it, this many chilies goes into a recipe for mole rojo, red mole, for 8 people. So mole is not just the dish, mole is an event in Mexico, and we'll talk more about it. But what I'd like to show you right here is how to toast chilies. These are raw, and in their raw state, even though they've been dried, they'll have bitterness and sort of harsh, aggressive flavors that need to be reconciled, if you will. And the way to do it is to toast it in a dry pan. So if I take a chili like this and a towel, and I put this into a hot pan, and then I press it down against the surface of the pan, very, very quickly, the chili will soften, and you may see a wisp or two of smoke coming off the pan. And the color of the chili itself will become mottled. Now, it takes, in a hot pan, maybe 10 seconds. That one is already toasted. Just so you can see what happens, I'm going to tear a chili open. This is what it looks like on the inside before it's been toasted. And I'm going to put it into the pan. And you hear it crackle a little bit. And there's the smoke. And when I take it out and you look at it, you can see that the color has lightened and it's begun to blister just a little bit. Now, a word of caution. When you get a chili like this that has a very shiny skin and smooth, remember what I said, that means that this chili has thin flesh. And so when you toast it, it won't tolerate an aggressive toasting. So I put it in and very, very quickly turn it over. Don't allow it to scorch and burn. If you see it starting to get black, you went too far. So that chili is done. I'll do the same here. Now I'm going to toast all of these chilies, but certainly you don't need to watch me do it. What I would like you to see, however, is once the chilies are toasted, we need to take and remove the seeds and the stem and maybe even any ribs that you see on the inside. You don't have to be too careful with it. That's done. When you're doing this, recognize that there's a compound that you can't see, but it's all over your fingers or my fingers. It's a compound called capsaicin, and that's what makes chilies hot. And capsaicin will burn not just your hands, but your eyes or your lips or your face or actually anything else that you touch. So be careful about what you touch, but at the very least, make a point of washing your hands. And remember, capsaicin is oily, so you need soap to get that oil off your hands. Just water won't do it. Once the chilies are all cleaned, take some hot water, and we're going to pour hot water over the top of the chilies and give them about 15 or 20 minutes to rehydrate. In effect, we're going to turn these back into fresh chilies. I toasted that big mountain of chilies, and now they're soaking. Here is the mulattos, the anchos, and the guajillos. While they soak, I'm going to talk about some of the other flavorings and show you the techniques that the Mexicans use to develop flavor in those ingredients. So, as an example, garlic is not peeled. They leave it in the papery husk, and they put it into a dry pan, and in effect, they create roasted garlic inside the papery husk. I'm going to do the same thing with onion. I'm going to cut it into wedges. I'm not even going to peel the skin off the outside. I'm just going to take it, and that likewise goes into this dry pan. And what I want to do is see to it that it gets caramelized on the outside, even a little charred is okay, and that the flesh is cooked. The flesh is cooked. Now, here I have some tomatoes. I'm going to do something similar to them. Instead of doing it in a dry pan, however, I'm going to put them under the broiler, and after about 8 to 10 minutes, I've turned them once. This is what I end up with. The outside of the tomatoes has blackened. You can see it here. But most importantly, the flesh has collapsed. It's given up. And it's an easy thing to take the worst of the black off the outside and set it aside and capture the tomato's flesh on the inside, which is so much more than fresh tomato. It is caramelized and rich and concentrated. If you discover any juice left on the pan, make sure that that goes into your mole. Okay, laid out in front of us, I've got some other ingredients. Now, Mexican cooks, when they touch an ingredient, they enhance its flavor. So as an example, peanuts taste great, but toasted peanuts or fried peanuts, even a little bit better. And so I'm going to put those into the oil. I've got some pecans here. I toasted those in the oven. I had them toasted already, so I don't need to toast those. I'm going to take some raisins and fry them. And I'll give you a chance to see that in just a second. Here is Mexican oregano. If you can't find it, and it's pretty readily available in Mexican groceries, you can use or substitute marjoram, which is more floral than oregano and more like what we have in this container here. All right, you can see that these peanuts are starting to bubble in the hot oil. Peanuts are fairly dense, so when they just start to take on a little bit of color, that's when I want to take them out. Mole, the dish that we're making, mole rojo or red mole, is just one of any number of moles that you will find in Mexico. Most of the moles come from the area around Oaxaca. I think of Oaxaca as ground zero for mole. Let me just take these out and drain them. And then in goes raisins. And what you'll see is these are going to puff up. The moisture will turn to steam. They'll puff up very, very quickly. But the other thing that's happening is the sugar is caramelizing just a little bit. There you can see they've all puffed up, and I don't want to let that sugar burn, just start to caramelize, and so I'll take those out as well. We'll set that aside. Anyhow, back to mole. In Oaxaca, they have not just one mole, but 7 different moles. And they're justly famous for them. When you talk about them, they talk to you about their 7 moles as if they're the 7 wonders of Oaxaca. There is fairly simple moles. Coloradito, for instance, a small colored mole, has 1 chili in it and 1 chili only. Ours has 3 different chilies. There's a chili called mole negro, which has typically 5 or 6, and it's almost black. They even take the seeds from the chilies and they turn them to charcoal, and then they soak them and add them to the mole. There is green and yellow moles, depending on the chilies they use, both fresh and dried. In the green mole, there's a lot of green herbs as well. There's a mole called manchamanteles, which has fruit in it, and its name translates as tablecloth stainer, because when this mole splashes onto the tablecloth, all bets are off. You're going to have to send that to the dry cleaners. We've got a couple of spices going into our mole, and I think of these spices really as a way of enhancing the flavor of the chilies. This is a chili dish first and foremost. In fact, I'd go a step further and say it's not a dish, it's an event. In Mexico, when they make mole, oftentimes they spend 3 days first gathering the ingredients and toasting the chilies. The next day, cooking the mole, and on the 3rd day, they would serve it. Anyhow, let me show you some of the spices. I've got black pepper and a little bit of cloves, and then I've got some cinnamon. And let me show you a couple of different examples of cinnamon here. This is a Chinese cinnamon that's taken from the cassia tree, and you can see they've left the bark on it. Here is the same cinnamon that's had the bark stripped from it, and it's a little bit of a finer cinnamon, a tighter quill, if you will, but this is really pretty woody. I can break it, but not easily. The Mexicans don't like to use the cassia bark. They like to use what they call true cinnamon or canela. And this is true cinnamon right here. It's also the bark of a tree, but you can see it's very delicate. If I were to roll this in my fingers, I can break it apart very, very easily. And while you all know the flavor of cassia bark, this is what you use in your holiday baking, when you smell this, it's much more fragrant and floral. If you ever ate a candy, Red Hots, when you were a kid, that's the flavor of canela, true cinnamon. So I'm going to gather this up and I'm going to add it to the spices. Let's see here. Now that these are cool, our raisins have shrunk back down again. I'm going to put them back into their bowl. Cinnamon, spices, oregano, fried ingredients, chilies, and the tomatoes. This really is the heart of our mole rojo. I know it seems like a lot of work, but this dish, I will guarantee you, is worth the effort. So here's all the flavorings laid out here. We're going to make a puree of this. In Mexico, they would use a metate, 2 stones, basically a stone rolling pin and a slab of stone. But we're lucky enough to have a blender to help me with this task. We're going to take and make a puree that's going to be seared in hot fat. And just a word of caution up front, the wetter you make this puree, the more explosive it becomes in hot fat. So make an effort to keep it pretty dry. I'm going to begin with the wettest ingredients. I'm going to put the tomatoes in the bottom there. And then the chilies, and I'm going to take them out and drain off some of that liquid. That was the mulattoes. Here are the anchos. I'm going to add the guajillos, and there's a lot of guajillos because ours is a mole rojo, or a red mole. If we need to add a little bit of this soaking liquid, we can. Oftentimes I taste it, however, because it can be bitter if we're not careful. So there's all the chilies in, the peanuts and raisins, the Mexican oregano, all of the spices, including canela. There's our pecans. And remember this, that before the Americas were discovered, the cuisine was pretty lean, and so they used a lot of nuts and seeds to make food richer. Here is some sesame seeds that were toasted. Okay, let's go ahead and puree this. Now, just occurred to me we have one more ingredient to add, and I'm glad I could smell it just to remind me. You'll recall that earlier we put the onions in the pan to roast, and I left the skin on. It's easy to peel it off. I'm going to take those and add them right into our blender. I've got some cloves of garlic that have become roasted garlic right inside the papery husk. And I can just peel that papery husk away. There's another right there. And throw that in. And again, we'll stir this down, and then we'll be ready to move forward. Everything's blended. It's nice and smooth. I haven't had to add a lot of liquid, but I did have to stir it down once or twice just to facilitate the blending process. The next step is really unique, and just the way we toasted the chilies to make the flavor deeper and richer, the searing of this puree has exactly the same effect. We now start to create this wonderful, complex, deep, rich conglomeration of flavors, if you will, that is so much more than the sum of the parts. I have a pan on the heat. It's getting hot right now. I've got some fat, flavorful fat. They would use lard in Mexico, but I'm using vegetable oil here today. And I've got a spatula with a flat side on it because I want to be able to scrape the bottom of the pan to free up anything that might want to catch and burn. We're going to cook this puree in hot oil. And initially, the oil will begin to emulsify with the puree. And then, as it cooks longer and longer, and it'll cook for about 15 minutes, the oil will begin to separate from the puree. It'll start to glisten just a little bit. And that's your clue that it's time to move on. From that point forward, all we do is add stock to this preparation and simmer it until our sauce is done. We can season it, we can serve it, and you'll be amazed at the results. So this is going to unfold fairly quickly. So I'll just tell you again, hot pan, oil in the pan, add the puree, and then take it from a liquid to a semi-solid, almost like tomato paste, that begins to glisten with the fat as it begins to break out. So the way to earn your money now as a chef is to scrape the bottom of the pan and make sure that it doesn't catch and burn. Just keep after it. Keep the heat on high, and if you ever notice that it's starting to burn on the bottom and you just can't keep up with it, pull it off the heat for just a second and in a relaxed way just clean up the pan and then move it back on. You might want to have somebody to spell you. This takes about 15 minutes to cook. In Mexico, this would be the kind of thing that women would gather together, and if there was a wedding, they might make mole for the entire village. As I said, mole is more of an event than it is actually a dish. And so sharing the task of making mole with multiple people is a nice way to spend an afternoon. Now, this, as I said, will cook for a little bit of time, but I have one here that has been cooked already. And you can see the difference in the two. One is still liquid, the other is no longer liquid. One is starting to glisten with the fat. One is certainly darker, and one has the consistency almost of tomato paste. And I would say it took about 15 to 20 minutes to go from this to that. The payoff is in flavor. The payoff is in complexity, and the payoff is in depth of flavor. A lot of people would say that, chili dishes aren't their thing because they're hot, they're aggressive, they hurt my palate. It's this technique right here that will make this so smooth and round that you will beg for somebody to make mole for you. You can see here, this pot has cooked to the point where the fat has broken out. Nothing is sticking really to the bottom of the pot any longer because of that fat. And it's the consistency of tomato paste. You can see how it holds its shape on the spatula. Once we get there, the next step is to introduce some stock. And I've got turkey stock here because I'm going to be serving this with turkey. And we're going to add that stock to this pan a little at a time and smooth it out. You can take advantage of how thick it is initially to break up any lumps. So add the stock incrementally. And add stock until your sauce is a little bit thinner than you might ultimately want it. And then we can reduce it until we get the right consistency. Now, as I said, this may look like a lot of sauce, but this is really a portion for about 8-10 people, something like that. As this comes together, you might want to taste it along the way because it will evolve going forward. You might taste the sauce at this point, and it tastes a little bit flat. Reason being, it has not been seasoned. And maybe we can take care of that right now. I want to season it with a couple of things. I want to season it with salt. Likewise, I'm going to season it with sugar, and then I'm going to add some chocolate, but no pepper. Pepper is unnecessary because we have so many chilies in here already. This is Mexican chocolate, and it is a chocolate that they use to make a beverage. It's granular with sugar. There's some spices added to it as well. And its role is to really underscore the ripe, sort of sun-dried tomato prune flavors of an ancho chili. There's a good deal of sugar in there, and that will reinforce the idea that that is a ripe chili, or a ripe fruit, if you will. So we'll stir the chocolate in, and once it's dissolved, you might decide to taste it again. And sort of explore the relationship between chilies and sweetness. Now, I've cooked for a long time. And if I were looking at a pot like this that has 2 quarts of sauce in it, I would pick up the salt and say, here we go. This is going to take about that much salt. And I would stir that in. And again, when you taste it, while you can taste the seasoning, I would not say that it's over-seasoned. We put so much effort into developing flavor in chilies and nuts and raisins and spices. This is so full of flavor, it's demanding of seasoning. So I'm going to do that again and again. And that then is about 4 times the salt I would ordinarily put in this volume of sauce. And to me, that tastes just about right. Remember, there's sugar in the chocolate, but I'm going to add a little bit of additional sugar. And the reason is that I want the flavor of those chilies to stand out in a very complex and ripe way. And sugar can do that for me. Now I can taste the chilies, I can taste the chocolate, I can taste the spices. And when you have it seasoned right, it's as if everything is there and available to you. All right. The sauce is done. And if you look at it, it's a little bit thicker than sauces you might ordinarily eat. That's entirely appropriate, but you can adjust the consistency. You know, to me it looks almost like heavy cream. It's that consistency, unwhipped heavy cream. It has a beautiful shine to it. We're going to serve that sauce on turkey. And in Mexico, they would cook the turkey in a pot of water, and that water would become the stock that would then go into this mole. Before I put this on, I'm going to get everything ready. I've got some hibiscus tea. This is a cooler that ordinarily they would enjoy in Mexico with a dish like this. A refresco, beer would be entirely appropriate. But this is made from hibiscus blossoms. You can see them right here. And you make this as an herb tea. I put about a cup into a quart of water, maybe 2 quarts of water. Bring it to a boil. Usually I add the zest of a lemon. Let it steep for 20 minutes. Drain it, sweeten it, and it's a great addition. Any accompaniments, rice, beans, tortillas, need to be gotten ready. And then we're going to add mole to the turkey. And as I said, don't be shy with the sauce. 6 to 8 ounces per portion. You might want to put some on the platter, and then maybe a little bit more on the side in a sauce boat for people to enjoy. There is so much flavor in this sauce that the role of garnishes becomes very distinct. Sometimes there's so much flavor you need a little bit of respite. So think about Mexican food, using raw onions or shredded lettuce or salty cheeses as a garnish. What we're using here is something fresh that's already in there, sesame seeds. We'll put that on the table, and that's mole rojo.